My name is Nolan Mercer. I'm 34 now, and for most of my life, I thought if I stayed patient long enough, people would eventually love me the way I loved them. I don't think that anymore. The strange part is, my father would probably tell you he always loved me. He'd sound sincere saying it too. That was the problem with my dad, Richard. He wasn't cruel in the loud, obvious kind of way. He wasn't the screaming father people cut off after one dramatic fight. He was worse at something quieter. He could look you directly in the eye while failing you completely. And somehow make you feel guilty for noticing. The last time I saw him cry was at my mother's funeral. I was 16. It was raining so hard that morning the cemetery workers had laid fake green turf around the grave to keep people from sinking into the mud. I remember staring at everyone's shoes instead of their faces because looking at faces made everything feel too real. My mom's name was Evelyn Mercer. She had this calm way about her. Even when she was tired, even when chemo hollowed out her cheeks and made her hands shake near the end, she still somehow noticed little things. Like whether I'd eaten breakfast. Whether I sounded nervous before a test. Whether I was pretending not to be upset. She noticed everything. A week before she died, she asked me to help her organize her jewelry box. Not because it was valuable. Most of it wasn't. A couple gold bracelets from my grandfather. Her wedding ring. Pearl earrings she wore every Christmas. A silver necklace with a tiny sapphire that my dad bought her when they were barely making rent. She touched each piece carefully like it held memories instead of metal. "This one's for your future wife someday," she told me softly, holding up the sapphire necklace. I laughed awkwardly because I was 16 and girls still terrified me. "Mom! I'm serious, Nolan." She smiled a little then coughed into a tissue. I hated that cough. It sounded painful even when she tried to hide it. "You keep things?" she said quietly. "Your father lets things go. Promise me you'll keep a few things." I promised. At 16, you think promises still protect people. A month later she was gone. And for a little while, it felt like my dad and I were surviving the same disaster together. People brought casseroles we didn't eat. Family members filled the house with soft voices and fake sympathy. My Aunt Denise kept touching my shoulder every 5 minutes like she was trying to remind herself I existed. Dad mostly sat in silence. At night, I'd hear him walking around downstairs after midnight. Cabinet doors opening. Ice clinking into glasses. I thought grief was making us closer. Looking back now, I think we were just drowning differently. For almost a year, it was just us. And honestly, those months weren't terrible. We ordered too much takeout. Forgot laundry in the dryer. Burned frozen pizzas because neither of us remembered the oven timer. Sometimes he'd knock on my bedroom door and ask if I wanted to watch a game with him. Sometimes we'd sit there for hours barely talking. I held on to those moments for years afterward. Longer than I should have. Because eventually Claire showed up. And everything changed so gradually I almost couldn't pinpoint when my home stopped feeling like mine. Dad met her at work apparently. She worked in accounting for a construction supplier his company partnered with. Blonde. Perfect teeth. 10 years younger than him. Always smelled faintly like expensive perfume and cinnamon gum. At first, I actually tried. That's the part people never understand later. I tried so hard. When Dad first introduced us at dinner, Claire smiled warmly and asked about school. "What colleges are you thinking about?" I shrugged. "Not sure yet." "He's good with computers," Dad said. I still remember that. Not Nolan loves software design. Not Nolan builds little programs in his room for fun. Not Nolan stayed up until 2 teaching himself code online. Just, he's good with computers. Like I was a teenager who knew how to reset the Wi-Fi. Claire nodded politely. "That's useful these days." Useful. I don't know why that bothered me so much. Maybe because Mom used to listen when I talked about things. Even if she didn't fully understand programming, she acted like it mattered because it mattered to me. Claire had this way of smiling through conversations instead of actually being in them. But she wasn't openly mean. That would have been easier. No, Claire specialized in subtle rearrangements. My mom's books disappeared from the living room shelves first. Then framed photos. Then blankets. Then little things you wouldn't notice unless you knew the house by heart. I came home from school one afternoon and froze in the hallway because Mom's painting was gone. It used to hang near the stairs. A watercolor beach scene she painted herself during some community art class years ago. Claire looked up from the kitchen island. "Oh," she said casually. "I moved that to storage. It didn't really match." Storage. Like my mother had become seasonal decoration. Dad saw my expression immediately. "Nolan," he said carefully. "Claire's just trying to make the place feel fresh." Fresh. I remember staring at him, waiting for something else. Some recognition that this was weird. Wrong. Nothing came. That night I sat in my room listening to drawers opening downstairs while Claire reorganized parts of the house that didn't belong to her yet. A weird thought hit me then. If someone erased enough evidence of a person, would grief eventually start feeling fake? Because that house stopped looking like my mother lived there frighteningly fast. About 6 months later, Dad remarried. Small ceremony. Beachside resort. I didn't go. Officially, it was because of school obligations. That's what Dad told relatives. The truth was simpler. I couldn't stand watching another woman wear my mother's place like a costume. Dad didn't argue much when I said I wanted to stay home. I think part of him already knew. That was another thing about my father. He avoided discomfort like it physically hurt him. If something required emotional honesty, he'd reroute around it immediately. After the wedding, Claire moved in fully. And slowly, the rules changed. Not openly. Quietly. Suddenly there were comments about electricity bills if my computer stayed on overnight. Comments about groceries. Comments about contributing. I was 17. Still in high school. But Claire talked about me like I was an unemployed 30-year-old roommate. One night at dinner, she smiled while sipping wine and said, "I just think it's important boys learn independence early." Dad nodded vaguely. I stared down at my plate. Boys. Not Nolan. Not your son. Just boys. That became her favorite thing actually. Turning personal things into broad life lessons. If she excluded me from dinner plans, it became teenagers need space. If Dad missed my school event, it became work responsibilities. If I looked upset, I was being sensitive. It was psychological camouflage. Everything sounded reasonable until you lived inside it every day. Then came the jewelry. Honestly, even now, that's the memory that still gets under my skin. Not because of the money. Because of what it meant. I came home early from school one afternoon because one of my teachers canceled class. The house was quiet except for music upstairs. I remember hearing Claire laugh in their bedroom. Then Dad laughing too. I walked past the open door without meaning to look inside. And stopped. Claire stood in front of the mirror wearing my mother's sapphire necklace. The one Mom had touched with trembling fingers. The one she told me to keep safe. Claire tilted it against her collarbone. "Do you think it's too much for dinner tonight?" Dad smiled. "No. She'd want someone wearing it." Something inside me went completely still. I don't even think they noticed me at first. Then Claire saw me in the mirror. Her smile faltered just slightly. "Oh," she said. "Nolan." I looked directly at my father. "That was Mom's." He shifted uncomfortably. "I know. She wanted me to keep it." Claire crossed her arms gently. "Your father thought it would be nice if some of Evelyn's things were still appreciated instead of sitting in storage." Appreciated. Like my mother had died and immediately become community property. Dad sighed. "Nolan, don't start. Don't start." I still remember how cold my hands felt. "You gave her Mom's jewelry? She's my wife." He snapped suddenly, defensive now. "What did you expect me to do? Leave everything boxed forever?" I looked at him for a long second. Then at the necklace. Then back at him. And I realized something quietly devastating. He had already moved on from protecting my mother's memory. But I hadn't. Which meant from that moment forward, I was going to become inconvenient. I wish I could tell you I screamed. That I grabbed the necklace. That I told Claire exactly what I thought of her. But I didn't. I just nodded once. Then walked back downstairs. I heard Dad call my name once from the hallway, annoyed more than concerned. I kept walking. That night, I packed a duffel bag and called my friend Marcus. His mom answered. "Honey?" I swallowed hard. Is Marcus home? Something in my voice must have sounded wrong because her tone changed immediately. Are you okay? And for some reason, that simple question almost broke me more than everything else combined. Because nobody in my own house had asked me that in a very long time. I stayed with Marcus and his family for 3 days before Dad finally showed up. Not because he missed me. Because people were starting to notice. That sounds harsh, but it's true. He pulled into the driveway Saturday afternoon wearing sunglasses even though it was cloudy out. Dad always did that when he wanted emotional distance during conversations. Marcus stayed inside while I walked out to the curb. Dad leaned against his car awkwardly. You embarrassed Claire. I actually laughed a little. Not because it was funny. Because somehow I'd still expected him to say something different. You gave her mom's necklace. She's part of this family now. I looked at him carefully. You mean your family? His jaw tightened. Nolan, this attitude. No, Dad. Seriously. You let her erase Mom from the house piece by piece and expected me to smile through it. That's not what happened. It is. He rubbed his forehead like I was exhausting him. God. That used to hurt so much. The way he made my grief feel inconvenient. You're acting immature. I nodded slowly. Okay. Maybe that surprised him. Because he paused. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. And I meant it. Something had shifted in me already. Tiny but important. I think that was the first time I stopped trying to convince him to understand me. You can only explain pain so many times before silence becomes easier. Dad exhaled sharply. Come home. Not. I'm sorry. Not. I handled things badly. Just. Come home. Like the problem was my location. I looked past him toward the street for a second. Kids riding bikes. Someone mowing the lawn. Completely normal Saturday afternoon. Meanwhile, my entire relationship with my father was quietly cracking apart in the middle of it. I'll come back, I said finally. Until graduation. He looked relieved immediately. Good. That relief told me everything. He didn't want resolution. He wanted compliance. And for a while I gave it to him. Not because things improved. Because I was tired. After I moved back in, I stopped fighting about almost everything. That probably sounds dramatic, but it wasn't some big declaration. I didn't storm around acting cold. I just pulled inward. Dinner conversations became shorter. I stayed in my room more. When Claire redecorated the downstairs bathroom with some fake farmhouse aesthetic Mom would have hated, I said nothing. When Dad forgot my 18th birthday dinner because Claire booked them tickets to a wine tasting weekend, I told him it was fine. That one actually hurt more than the jewelry. Not immediately. Weirdly, I laughed when he called. Nolan, buddy, I completely lost track of the dates. Behind him I could hear restaurant noise. Claire laughing at something. It's okay. You sure? Yeah. He sounded relieved again. Always relieved when emotions disappeared quickly. After we hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen eating grocery store cheesecake straight from the container, while the microwave clock turned midnight. I remember thinking, this is probably what emotional distance feels like at the beginning. Not anger. Just exhaustion. The strange thing is people often reward you when you stop needing things from them. Claire started calling me easygoing after that. Dad said he was proud I was maturing. What they really meant was I had stopped making my pain visible. And that made life easier for them. By senior year, I was barely home mentally anyway. I spent most evenings teaching myself coding and web infrastructure online. Nothing glamorous. Old forums. Cheap courses. Free tutorials. I liked programming because computers made sense. People said one thing and meant another all the time. Code didn't. Either something worked or it didn't. By the time graduation came around, I already knew I wasn't staying. Not in that house. Not in that version of my life. I'd gotten accepted into a state university about 3 hours away with partial financial aid. Not some elite school people bragged about at country clubs. Just a solid program with decent computer science professors and cheap dorms. Honestly, it felt perfect. Far enough to breathe. Close enough that nobody could accuse me of abandoning family. Dad barely reacted when I told him. That's good, he said while scrolling through emails on his phone. Claire smiled politely from across the kitchen island. You'll learn a lot living on your own. I almost said I already have. Instead, I nodded. There was this strange emotional numbness settling into me back then. Like my brain had realized disappointment was easier to carry in smaller doses. A week before I moved out, I found one of Mom's old recipe cards shoved into a drawer behind takeout menus. Her handwriting stopped me cold. Chicken soup. Extra time. Don't rush onions. Tiny things. I sat on the kitchen floor for probably 10 minutes staring at that card like an idiot. It hit me then how terrified I'd been of forgetting her voice. People don't talk enough about that part of grief. The panic behind it. You start mentally replaying ordinary moments because you realize one day they'll be harder to remember clearly. The sound of her calling me downstairs. The way she tapped counters while thinking. How she tucked hair behind her ear when reading. I slipped the recipe card into my backpack before Claire could declutter it too. That card stayed with me for years. Still does, actually. The morning I left for college, Dad helped carry boxes to my car. It should have felt emotional. Some father-son milestone. Instead, it felt like two coworkers finishing a task. You got your charger? He asked. Yeah. Laundry detergent? Yep. Claire stood on the porch holding coffee. Don't live entirely on ramen, Nolan. I forced a smile. Dad clapped my shoulder awkwardly before I got into the driver's seat. Call sometimes. I looked at him through the open door. I will. And I meant it at the time. That's the thing people misunderstand about strained family relationships. Distance usually doesn't happen all at once. It happens through 1,000 tiny disappointments people convince themselves aren't important enough to matter individually. Then one day you realize there's nothing left underneath. College felt strange at first. Not exciting exactly. Quiet. Nobody knew me there. Nobody compared me to who I used to be before my mom died. Nobody acted uncomfortable around grief that was years old but still sitting heavy in my chest. For the first time in a long time, I could just exist without constantly monitoring someone else's moods. My roommate was this hyperactive business major named Theo who talked in his sleep and somehow made friends in every building within 2 weeks. You look like a guy who apologizes when people bump into you. He told me the second month we lived together. What? You heard me. I laughed despite myself. Theo pointed a spoon at me from across the room. That's trauma behavior. Okay, Dr. Phil. I'm serious. You act like you're trying not to take up space. I brushed it off then. But later that night, I kept thinking about it. Because maybe he wasn't completely wrong. I worked constantly during college. Partly because I needed money. Mostly because staying busy kept certain thoughts quiet. I took freelance coding jobs online. Built ugly websites for small businesses. Fixed back-end problems for startups too cheap to hire real developers. Most of the work sucked. One client paid me in restaurant gift cards once because his accounts were temporarily frozen. Another disappeared halfway through a project after demanding 3 weeks of revisions. But little by little, I got better. And something else happened too. People started valuing my work. Not emotionally. Professionally. Turns out competence changes how the world speaks to you. Professors remembered my name. Clients recommended me. Classmates asked for help. Nobody cared that I was awkward sometimes or quiet at parties or still figuring myself out emotionally. They cared whether I could solve problems. And I could. Meanwhile, home kept getting smaller emotionally. Dad called less and less unless he needed something practical. Insurance questions. Tax forms. Computer help. Claire occasionally sent group texts with forced enthusiasm. Family barbecue next Sunday. Hope college is treating you well, smiley face. Everything looked normal from the outside. That was the weird part. If you gathered all our text messages together, we probably seemed like a functional family. But emotionally? There was nothing underneath anymore. I came home for Thanksgiving during sophomore year and immediately noticed the house smelled different. Claire had replaced Mom's old vanilla candles with these aggressively sharp eucalyptus ones that made the whole place smell like a hotel lobby. Dad hugged me quickly. Good drive? Yeah. You still doing computer stuff? Computer stuff. I don't know why that phrase irritated me every single time. Software development. I corrected gently. Right. Claire appeared from the kitchen smiling brightly. Nolan! You're thinner. Good to see you too. Dinner that night felt like attending somebody else's family gathering. Claire dominated most conversations while Dad nodded along. Her sister Melissa was there too, along with Melissa's son Grant. Grant was one of those guys who treated confidence like a substitute for personality. Loud. Expensive haircut. Always talking over people. He was 24 and already worked at Claire's brother-in-law's real estate company, which he mentioned constantly. At one point he asked what I was studying. Computer science. He smirked. So basically coding apps and hoodies? Claire laughed lightly. Dad smiled into his drink. I said, something like that. That was another skill I'd developed by then. Not reacting. People think restraint means weakness because they don't understand how much energy self-control actually takes. Grant kept going anyway. My company's looking at AI stuff now. Crazy money in it. Yeah, I said. You should come work for us after graduation. We could probably use an IT guy. IT guy. I almost corrected him again but stopped myself. What was the point? Nobody at that table actually wanted to know what I did. They wanted categories that made sense to them. Later that night, I went upstairs to my old room and noticed most of my things were gone. Not packed away carefully. Just reduced. Smaller desk. Different curtains. Boxes missing. Claire had converted part of the closet into storage for holiday decorations. I sat on the bed staring around the room feeling oddly detached. Like visiting a childhood home preserved incorrectly. Dad knocked softly before stepping inside. You okay? Yeah. He leaned against the doorway. Claire's trying hard, you know. There it was again. Always managing her feelings. Always translating reality into something easier to digest. I know. She worries you don't like her. I looked up slowly. The crazy thing? For a second, I almost laughed. Because after everything, somehow her discomfort was still the emotional emergency. I barely know her, I said. Dad sighed. You make things difficult sometimes. That sentence stayed with me for years. Not because it was cruel. Because he genuinely believed it. In his mind, wanting emotional consideration counted as difficulty. I looked around the room quietly. Then back at him. You ever think maybe things were already difficult? His expression shifted slightly. Defensive again. We all lost your mother, Nolan. I nodded once. But I noticed something important in that moment. He always said your mother. Never my wife. Like even grief had become compartmentalized over time. Dad cleared his throat. You coming down for dessert? In a minute. He hesitated like he wanted the conversation to feel resolved somehow. Then he left. I waited until his footsteps disappeared before leaning back against the wall and closing my eyes. I don't know why, but that night felt final to me. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just final. Like some part of me finally accepted that I was never getting my old father back. And honestly, that realization hurt less than constantly hoping. By graduation, I had built a small freelance business that was making more money than most entry-level jobs. Not millions. Nothing flashy. But enough that recruiters started reaching out. Enough that I could choose. Theo was the first person who pushed me towards starting something bigger. We were sitting in a diner near campus at like 1 a.m. while he inhaled pancakes. You realize half these companies hiring you are run by idiots, right? I laughed. Probably. No, seriously. You solve problems faster than entire teams. I'm not running a company. Why not? Because I didn't think people like me did that. I didn't say it out loud, but that was the truth. Somewhere deep down, I still carried this old belief that I was the side character in other people's important lives. Useful. Reliable. Forgettable. Theo shook his head. You know what your issue is? I'm sure you'll tell me. You still act like someone waiting for permission. That irritated me because it felt true. A month later, I graduated. Dad and Claire came to the ceremony. Claire cried during the speeches. Dad kept taking blurry photos on his phone. For a little while, things almost felt normal again. Then after graduation dinner, Dad handed me a card. Inside was a check for $500. Thought it might help you get started. I looked up surprised. Thanks. He smiled. Proud of you, son. And maybe that should have healed something. Maybe a healthier person would have just accepted the moment for what it was. But sitting there holding that check, all I could think about was the sapphire necklace. The missed birthdays. The constant minimizing. The years of emotional absence wrapped inside polite conversations. Because the truth is, small gestures don't erase long patterns. And deep down, I think he knew that too. Still, I hugged him before we left the restaurant. Because despite everything, part of me still wanted a father. That's what made the next few years so complicated. Because while my life finally started growing, my relationship with him stayed emotionally frozen in place. After graduation, I moved to Chicago with 2 suitcases, a second-hand desk, and just enough savings to survive 6 months if everything went wrong. Which, honestly, felt very possible. Theo moved too. He'd landed some operations job at a logistics startup, and somehow convinced me to split a tiny apartment with him in Wicker Park that had uneven floors and a radiator that sounded like it was dying every night. But it was ours. No careful silences. No walking on eggshells. No pretending things didn't hurt. That first year was brutal in ways nobody romanticizes. I worked constantly. Freelance projects during the day. Contract security work at night. Bug fixes at 2 in the morning for clients in different time zones. Some months I barely slept. Other months I worried rent would wipe out my account completely. But slowly, things started building. A cybersecurity company hired me temporarily to clean up a server breach. Then they referred me to another client. Then another. Turns out companies paid very well when losing data could cost them millions. I wasn't charismatic. I wasn't some genius billionaire-type founder. I was just good at solving problems calmly while everyone else panicked. And for the first time in my life, that actually mattered. By 28, I had 3 employees. By 30, 11. That's when Mercer Digital Solutions officially became a real company instead of just me sitting in sweatpants behind 3 monitors eating cold takeout. Theo handled operations eventually. I handled technical strategy and clients. We grew carefully. No flashy offices. No stupid luxury spending. No pretending success meant acting important. I still drove a 6-year-old Honda. Still checked prices at grocery stores. Trauma does that, I think. Even after stability arrives, some part of you still expects everything to disappear overnight. Meanwhile, Dad stayed mostly distant unless he needed something. That pattern never changed. Every few months he'd call asking for quick tech advice. Claire occasionally texted holiday photos. Grant, the same cousin who mocked coding at Thanksgiving, started messaging me on LinkedIn after crypto and tech became trendy. Bro, we should collaborate sometime. I ignored most of them. Not angrily. Just tiredly. Because once you stop chasing approval, certain conversations lose oxygen naturally. Then came the betrayal that finally ended whatever fragile loyalty I still had left. And weirdly, it started with my mother's ring. I got a call from my Aunt Denise one Saturday morning. We weren't especially close, but she was one of the few people from that side of the family who still spoke to me like I mattered. Nolan, she said carefully. Have you talked to your father recently? Not really. Why? There was a pause. I think there's something you should know. My stomach tightened immediately. She sounded uncomfortable. You remember your mother's jewelry? Instantly, my chest went cold. Yeah. Another pause. Then quietly. Claire sold most of it. I actually thought I'd misheard her. What? She hosted some charity auction event last month. Apparently she sold several pieces privately beforehand too. For a second, I genuinely couldn't speak. I stood in my kitchen staring out the window while traffic moved below me in blurry streaks. No, I said finally. Dad wouldn't let her do that. Denise exhaled softly. Honey, I don't think your father stopped her. Something ugly twisted in my stomach then. Not explosive anger. Something worse. Recognition. Because suddenly every moment connected together perfectly. The necklace. The missing photos. The storage boxes. The constant minimizing. Mom hadn't been preserved in that house. She'd been gradually erased. I sat down slowly at the counter. What was sold? I don't know everything. But Evelyn's sapphire necklace for sure. I closed my eyes. For a second, I was 16 again standing in that hallway. She said she wasn't attached to them emotionally, Denise added carefully. That it was healthier to move forward. Move forward. I laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny. Because some people can justify almost anything if they use calm enough language. Did Dad say anything? Denise hesitated. That's actually why I called. Something in her tone changed. He defended her, Nolan. That shouldn't have hurt anymore. But somehow it did. Because deep down, some pathetic little part of me had still believed maybe my father kept certain lines uncrossable. Apparently not. I thanked Denise for telling me and hung up. Then I sat there alone for almost an hour. Not crying. Not yelling. Just staring at nothing while years of emotional confusion finally settled into clarity. My father wasn't weak temporarily. This wasn't grief anymore. This was who he chose to become. And maybe the hardest part. He probably still thought of himself as a good man. A week later, Dad called me. Like normal. Like nothing had happened. Nolan! Been trying to reach you. I kept my voice even. Busy. Your aunt said she talked to you. There it was. Straight to damage control. I leaned back in my chair. Did Claire sell Mom's jewelry? Silence. Then. She sold a few pieces. A few. Nolan, your mother's been gone for 14 years. I stared at the skyline outside my office window. It was raining lightly over downtown Chicago. Cars crawling through traffic below. Normal day. Normal conversation. Meanwhile, something permanent was finally breaking in me. She wanted me to keep some of those. Dad sighed, immediately irritated. She's gone, son. Son. He only used that word when he wanted emotional leverage. Claire's voice drifted faintly through the phone in the background, asking something. Dad muted her briefly. You have to stop holding on to objects like they're people. That sentence did it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just completely. Because suddenly I understood something very clearly. He had spent years treating my grief like emotional immaturity because it made his own choices easier to live with. I spoke quietly. Did you sell the wedding ring too? Silence again. And that silence told me everything before he answered. Yes. I felt something inside me shut off emotionally. Cleanly. Calmly. Like a door locking. Okay. Nolan. No, it's okay. You're overreacting. I almost smiled at that. 30 years old and somehow still being told my feelings were too inconvenient to count. You know what's interesting? I said softly. What? I spent years thinking Claire destroyed our relationship. He went quiet. But she didn't. I heard him breathing on the other end. You did. For once, he had no immediate response ready. No reframing. No emotional shortcut. Just silence. Then finally. That's unfair. Maybe. But it was true. And truth sounds unfair to people who benefit from avoiding it. Dad's voice hardened slightly. You need to let things go. I looked around my office. Glass walls. Employees working quietly outside. A company I built from scratch without him. And suddenly I realized something almost surreal. He still thought he was talking to the same lonely teenager from that hallway years ago. He had no idea how much distance existed between us now. I already did, I said calmly. Then I hung up. That was the first time in my life I ever ended a conversation with my father instead of waiting for his approval to leave it. And honestly, he hated it. After that, the messages changed. Not immediately aggressive. Worse. Performative. Claire started sending sentimental texts. We miss you. Family is important. Your father worries about you. Dad began calling more often. Leaving longer voicemails. Asking about dinner. Asking about visits. It felt strange suddenly becoming emotionally valuable after years of being emotionally optional. Theo noticed it too. We were staying late at the office one night when another voicemail notification popped up on my phone. He glanced at it. Your dad again? Yeah. You gonna answer? I shrugged. Theo studied me for a second. You know what's funny? What? People always come back when they realize you stopped waiting. That stuck with me. Because it was true. My father wasn't reconnecting because he suddenly understood my pain. He was reconnecting because he felt the distance now. And distance scares people once they realize it might be permanent. Still, I kept things polite. Short calls. Holiday texts. Minimal emotional access. I wasn't trying to punish him. I just genuinely didn't trust him anymore. There's a difference. Then, about 8 months later, everything flipped completely. And my father walked into my office without realizing whose company he was begging to save. The funny thing is, if my father had bothered asking more questions about my life over the years, he probably would have figured it out sooner. But he never really asked questions he didn't already expect easy answers to. So when his company started collapsing, he had no idea mine was the firm people were recommending to save it. I didn't even know there was a connection at first. It started with Theo forwarding me an email one Monday morning. Subject: urgent, security infrastructure consultation. Mid-sized construction supply company. Regional offices. Possible data breach. Financial exposure. Needed immediate containment and restructuring. Fairly standard for us. By then, Mercer Digital Solutions had grown to almost 40 employees. We handled cybersecurity, infrastructure recovery, and enterprise protection systems for companies too large for small IT teams but too small for giant corporate firms. Good business. Stressful business. Theo leaned into my office holding coffee. They're desperate, he said. Board wants emergency meetings this week. Okay. They're offering stupid money. Even better. He smirked. You sound dead inside. Monday morning? Fair enough. I barely glanced at the company name initially because we handled dozens of inquiries weekly. Then Theo said, apparently the CFO completely ignored security recommendations for years. I looked up. What company? He checked his tablet. Ridgeway Building Supply. And I froze. Because that was my father's company. Or at least the company he'd worked at since I was a kid. The room suddenly felt weirdly smaller. Theo noticed immediately. What? I rubbed my jaw slowly. My dad works there. Theo blinked. Seriously? Yeah. He sat down across from me carefully. You okay? That question still affected me sometimes. Maybe because I spent so many years around people who never asked it sincerely. I don't know. And honestly, I meant that. Because suddenly two separate parts of my life were colliding in a way I hadn't prepared for. Theo leaned back. You want me to pass it to another team? I thought about it for a second. Then shook my head. No. You sure? Yeah. I wasn't interested in revenge. That's important. People always imagine moments like this come with some dramatic rush of satisfaction. But sitting there staring at that company name, mostly I just felt tired. Still, I'd be lying if I said some small part of me didn't notice the irony. The same father who spent years dismissing my career as computer stuff was now working for a company desperate for exactly the kind of expertise I'd built my life around. Life's strange like that sometimes. 2 days later, their executive team arrived for the consultation meeting. I almost skipped it. Seriously. At the last minute, I considered handing everything off to another director and going home early. But something stopped me. Maybe closure. Maybe curiosity. Maybe I just wanted to see my father clearly for once without all the old, emotional fog. The conference room overlooked downtown Chicago. Rain streaked softly against the windows while our presentation loaded across the screen. Theo sat beside me reviewing notes. You look nervous, he muttered. I'm not nervous. You've reorganized that pen 6 times. I exhaled. Then the door opened. 3 executives walked in first. And behind them, my father. Older. That hit me immediately. Older than I remembered. His shoulders slumped more now. Gray heavier around his temples. Stress carved into his face. For a split second, he didn't recognize me. Why would he? Different suit. Different posture. Different life. Then his eyes locked onto mine. And he stopped walking. Actually stopped. The executive beside him kept talking for another few seconds before realizing nobody was following. Richard? Dad stared at me like he'd walked into the wrong building. Nolan? The room went very quiet. I stood calmly. Hi, Dad. One of the executives looked between us. Wait, you two know each other? Theo, bless him, Stayed completely expressionless. Dad looked stunned. You work here? Work here. I almost smiled. Yeah. Nobody else at the table understood the tension yet. The executive laughed awkwardly. Small world. Dad's eyes shifted slowly toward the company logo on the presentation screen. Mercer Digital Solutions. Then back to me. And I watched realization hit him in stages. First confusion. Then surprise. Then something deeper. Because suddenly he understood. The company they'd spent 2 weeks desperately trying to secure? The firm the board specifically requested? The people holding the solution to a disaster threatening millions in losses? It was mine. I saw the exact second it fully landed emotionally. His face changed. Subtly, but enough. And weirdly. I didn't feel triumphant. Just quiet. Very, very quiet. The meeting continued professionally after that, though Dad barely spoke for the first 20 minutes. I handled the presentation normally. Security failures. Infrastructure weaknesses. Financial exposure. Recovery timelines. No emotional games. No smug comments. Just work. But I noticed little things. The way Dad kept looking at me when he thought I wouldn't notice. The way his posture shifted whenever executives praised our systems. The way he avoided mentioning me personally. And honestly, that hurt more than if he'd acted angry. Because even then, part of him still seemed uncomfortable acknowledging who I'd become. About halfway through the meeting, one executive asked, So how long have you been running Mercer Digital? I answered simply. About 4 years officially. Impressive growth. Thank you. Dad stayed silent. Then another executive laughed lightly. Richard never mentioned his son owned one of the top cybersecurity firms in the region. There it was. The sentence hanging in the air. Dad cleared his throat. Nolan's always been good with computers. Good with computers. After everything, that was still the language he chose. Not brilliant. Not accomplished. Not successful. Just safe enough wording to protect his own ego. For the first time in years, I felt something close to pity. Because sitting there watching him struggle to emotionally process reality, I finally understood something. People who underestimate you for too long eventually become trapped by their own version of you. My father still saw me as the quiet teenager from that hallway. And now reality was embarrassing him publicly. Not because I exposed him. Because life did. After the meeting ended, the executives left to review contracts with Theo. Dad lingered awkwardly near the conference table. For a second neither of us spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Chicago traffic crawled below. Finally he said quietly, You built all this? I looked around the office. Yeah. He nodded slowly. It's impressive. There was genuine emotion in his voice this time. Maybe even pride. But it landed strangely late. Like receiving flowers years after the funeral. Thanks. Dad shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I didn't realize your company was this large. You never asked much about it. The words came out calm. Not accusing. Just true. He looked down briefly. I guess not. That silence between us felt enormous. Then he glanced toward the hallway where employees moved between offices. They respect you here. I almost laughed softly at that. Because something about the observation sounded so unfamiliar coming from him. Respect. Like he was finally noticing its absence all those years. Dad swallowed. I always knew you were smart. Maybe he believed that. But intelligence without respect still feels lonely. I leaned against the table slightly. You know what's weird? What? For years I thought if I worked hard enough, eventually you'd take me seriously. His face tightened. Nolan. But somewhere along the way, I continued calmly, I stopped needing that. He looked genuinely shaken by that sentence. Not angry. Worse. Sad. Because parents don't always notice when love turns into distance until the distance becomes permanent. Dad rubbed the back of his neck. We made mistakes. We. Interesting how accountability always became plural around him. I nodded once. Yeah. Then came the part that surprised me most. He looked smaller suddenly. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man realizing too late that the person he underestimated had quietly built a life that no longer revolved around him. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the smaller person in the room anymore. The thing about quiet success is that people don't notice it until they need something from you. That's when the tone changes. Suddenly the same people who dismissed you start introducing you differently. Suddenly your calls matter. Your time matters. Your opinion matters. And after years of being treated like an afterthought, that shift can mess with your head if you let it. I tried not to let it. But I'd be lying if I said watching my father slowly realize who I had become didn't affect me. Because for the first time in my life, he was careful around me. Not emotionally careful. Professionally careful. And somehow that stung more than all the old arguments. Ridgway's situation kept getting worse over the next month. The breach had exposed years of neglected infrastructure and financial mismanagement. Investors were panicking. Clients threatened lawsuits. 2 major vendors pulled contracts entirely. Every emergency meeting felt heavier than the last. And every single time? Mercer Digital walked in as the company keeping them alive. Theo loved the irony. He never said it directly during meetings, but afterward he'd lean against my office door smirking. The computer stuff company saved another $1 million today. I usually rolled my eyes. But deep down, yeah? I noticed it too. Especially my father. Because each time Ridgway executives praised our work, Dad looked a little more uncomfortable. Not jealous exactly. Regretful. Like reality kept forcing him to revisit every year he underestimated me. One afternoon, we finished a brutal 6-hour recovery session with Ridgway's board. Everyone looked exhausted. The CFO left first. Then legal. Eventually only Dad and I remained in the conference room gathering papers. He cleared his throat awkwardly. "You handled yourself well in there." "Thanks." Another silence. Then, "You always were calm under pressure." I almost laughed softly at that. No. I became calm under pressure because I grew up in a house where emotions got treated like problems. Big difference. Dad loosened his tie slightly. "You know, when you were younger, I thought you'd eventually grow out of all this tech stuff." There it was again. Still trying to make my entire life sound temporary. I looked at him calmly. "This company employs 42 people." He blinked. "I know." "No, I don't think you do." That caught him off guard. I stood slowly, gathering my laptop. "For years you talked about my career like it was a hobby you tolerated. Nolan. You introduced me as good with computers while I was building systems your company now depends on to survive." His face tightened immediately. "I didn't mean it like that." "But you did." Quiet. Direct. No anger. And somehow that made it hit harder. Dad looked down at the table. I continued before he could escape into another excuse. "You know what the strange part is?" He stayed silent. "I spent most of my 20s trying to prove I deserved respect from people who had already decided not to give it." His jaw flexed slightly. "That's not fair." I nodded slowly. "You're right. It wasn't." That one landed. Hard. Because for the first time, I wasn't asking him to understand me emotionally anymore. I was simply telling the truth out loud. And truth sounds very different when the person saying it no longer needs your approval afterward. Dad sat down slowly in one of the conference chairs. Suddenly he looked older than I'd ever seen him. "You think I failed you?" I looked at him for a long second. Then answered honestly. "I think you kept choosing whatever made your life easier." He opened his mouth. Closed it again. Because what defense was left? Claire wanted Mom's jewelry. Easier to give it away. I was hurt? Easier to call me sensitive. Conflict in the house? Easier to sacrifice the quieter person. That was the pattern. Always. And deep down, he knew it now too. A few weeks later came the moment everyone talks about when they ask how the revenge happened. Except it didn't feel like revenge when it happened. It felt like consequence. Natural, quiet consequence. Ridgway hosted a private investor dinner downtown trying to reassure partners the company would recover. Mercer Digital got invited because our systems were basically the only reason Ridgway hadn't collapsed entirely. Theo convinced me to attend. "You've spent 10 years becoming successful. You're allowed to exist publicly for one evening." The event was at this ridiculously expensive rooftop restaurant overlooking the river. Glass walls. Live piano music. People wearing watches worth more than my first apartment. I arrived late after another client call. And the second I walked in, I noticed something strange. My father was standing near the bar talking to two investors. One of them asked him something. Dad glanced across the room toward me, then straightened slightly. And for the first time in my entire life, I heard him say it clearly. "That's my son. He owns Mercer Digital." No minimizing. No jokes. No computer guy. No vague wording. Just pride. Real pride. The investors immediately shifted attention toward me. One walked over smiling. "I've been wanting to meet you. Your recovery systems saved Ridgeway." I shook his hand politely. "Appreciate that." Meanwhile, Dad stood a few feet away watching the conversation. And suddenly I understood something devastating. He respected me now because the world respected me first. Not because he finally saw me emotionally. Because my value became externally undeniable. That realization should have made me angry. Instead, weirdly, it made me free. Because in that moment, I stopped wanting anything from him permanently. No apology. No validation. No rewritten father-son relationship. Nothing. The hunger for it finally died. And once that happened, he lost the ability to hurt me. Later that night, Dad approached me alone near the terrace. The city lights reflected against the river below us. He looked nervous. Actually nervous. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he said quietly. "That sounds dangerous." To my surprise, he laughed softly. Then his expression faded again. "I owe you an apology." I stayed silent. "I should have protected your mother's things." His voice roughened slightly. "And I should have protected you more after she died." Wind rolled across the terrace. For years I imagined hearing those words. Thought they'd heal something huge inside me. But standing there at 34, successful, stable, emotionally detached, they just sounded late. Not meaningless. Just late. Dad swallowed hard. I thought keeping peace was the same thing as doing the right thing. There wasn't peace, I said calmly. There was just nobody stopping Claire. He looked down immediately. That truth hurt him more than yelling ever could have. "I know," he admitted. We stood there quietly for a minute. Then he said the thing I think scared him most. "You don't need me anymore." It wasn't a question. I looked out across the skyline. "No," I said honestly. "I don't." God. The expression on his face after that. Not dramatic heartbreak. Just the slow realization that time had kept moving while he assumed he could fix things later. Parents really believe there's always more time. More birthdays. More conversations. More chances. Until suddenly their child is standing in front of them emotionally unreachable. Dad nodded faintly. "I guess I earned that." Maybe he did. But strangely, I didn't feel victorious. Because revenge sounds satisfying in theory. In reality, it's usually quieter than people imagine. No screaming. No humiliation speech. No dramatic collapse. Just someone slowly realizing they lost access to a person who once loved them very deeply. And understanding too late that they were the reason why. About 4 months after Ridgeway signed with Mercer Digital, my father lost his job. Officially, it was restructuring. Unofficially, the board needed someone tied to years of bad decisions to take the fall. The same company he'd sacrificed so much for pushed him out with a short meeting and a severance packet. Funny how quickly people become replaceable once they stop being useful. He called me that night. I almost didn't answer. But I did. His voice sounded hollow. "They let me go." I leaned back in my office chair quietly. Outside my window, downtown Chicago glowed under cold rain. "I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it. Because despite everything, hearing your father sound broken does something to you. He let out a shaky breath. Claire left too. That part didn't surprise me. Apparently, after the fraud investigation connected to her failed investment deals started spreading around socially, she moved to Arizona permanently with her sister. A lot of people suddenly stopped taking her calls after that. Including the friends she spent years trying to impress. Dad gave a bitter laugh over the phone. She kept saying appearances mattered. I didn't respond. Because what was there to say? My mother's jewelry was gone. The house was sold. His marriage collapsed. His career ended. And none of it happened because I got revenge. It happened because he spent 20 years choosing comfort over accountability. Finally, he asked quietly, "Can we meet?" We met at a small diner near the suburbs the following Sunday. Dad looked older than I remembered. Not just tired. Defeated. For a while we made awkward conversation about weather and traffic before he finally looked at me across the table. "I owe you an apology." I stayed quiet. He rubbed his hands together slowly. "I should have protected your mom's things. And I should have protected you." Hearing it then felt strange. Because years ago I would have done anything for those words. Now they just felt late. "I know," I said calmly. His eyes watered slightly. "I thought keeping everyone happy made me a good father." I shook my head gently. "You kept whoever complained the loudest happy." That one hit him hard. He looked down immediately. Rain tapped softly against the diner windows. After a minute, he said quietly, "You built a good life without me." Not angry. Not bitter. Just realizing it. I nodded once. "Yeah. And honestly? That was the revenge. Not humiliating him. Not screaming. Not cutting him down publicly. Just becoming successful, respected, emotionally stable. Without needing anything from him anymore." Dad swallowed hard. "I'm proud of you." For the first time, I believed him. But some things don't heal just because someone finally says the right words after years of damage. I stood and grabbed my coat. Dad looked up quickly. "You leaving already?" "I have work tomorrow." He nodded slowly like he understood there was no fixing this in one conversation. Before leaving, I pulled Mom's old recipe card from my wallet and placed it on the table. The only thing of hers I managed to keep. Dad stared at her handwriting for a long time without speaking. Then his eyes closed briefly. That quiet reaction hurt more than any dramatic breakdown could have. Because finally, after losing everything else, he understood what those memories were actually worth. I left money on the table for coffee and headed toward the door. Behind me, my father stayed sitting there alone, staring at that recipe card with trembling hands. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel angry walking away from him. Just free.